Today on Shade to Sun, we are going to discuss science and psychic scientists.
Sounds of your freedom don't change like the seasons when shade turns to sun. When two become one, you follow your dreams.
Okay, first of all, there's just been some issues lately, and I am particularly irked over what people imagine science to be and what they imagine scientific evidence to be. So I thought it would be really good to address what is meant by science in the modern world and what it's not. There was just an article floating around, and there apparently is a Russian scientist who apparently performed, one or two experiments, and everybody in the New Age world thinks that this has proven something. Well, that's not how science works. Let me read a definition from Wikipedia that I think really sums up what science is about. Science says from Latin scientia, meaning knowledge, is a systematic enterprise that builds and organizes knowledge in the form of testable explanations and predictions about the universe. So the term testable explanations, in science, that means not that one guy did it, it means that a number of people can perform this experiment and get the same result. So just an example, if you wanted to find out, is it really true that a slice of bread with butter on it lands butter side down? You could actually test this. You just get a loaf of bread, butter one side, knock it off the counter, and count how many times it comes up butter side down, how many times it comes butter side up. So you do this 100 times, and you might think, it's like flipping a coin, right? You're going to have, on average, 50 times it comes up butter side, 50 times butter side down. But you would have to do this experiment, and then you would more than likely find out that it wouldn't be on average 50-50. It would probably be on average closer to 80-20. Why? Because of gravity. The way gravity works, and the butter on the bread causes a rotational factor. The frequency of rotation is about 8 feet. Counters are between 3 and 4 feet usually, so the butter side is typically down. So I haven't done this. I'd have to do this experiment or do research, but the thing is, this is an example where you would have an experiment, you would have data, and you could apply it to numbers and prove what has happened. Then someone else could take that information and say, well, that sounds interesting, I would like to verify if that's true or not. So they can repeat the experiment. And then when you have enough people repeating this experiment and publishing their numbers, as well as their methodology of how they set the experiment up, then you would have a scientific analysis of whether a slice of bread lands butter side up or butter side down. You have the information that backs it up. Also, if you're in the scientific community, you would want to take your results and show them among other scientists. This is called a peer review. And they would look at your setup, they would look at how you did your experiment and what your numbers were, and if they had any complaints, anything that says, well, gee, you're using margarine and not butter, and that's really, not what we're looking at. Or somebody could, whatever criticisms might exist, they could take that criticism and say, we do not approve of your experiment. So science often needs to pass peer review. And when you hear something about a claim being made and somebody says it's scientific, those are the two things you want to look at. You want to say, let me see the numbers. Actually, there's three things you should look at. Say, let me see the numbers. Let me see how the setup was handled. And at the same time, did it pass a peer review of other scientists who would be critical of the experiment? So that's how science works. Not one guy in a lab somewhere doing something and publishing a paper, and then all the New Age airheads say, oh, this guy has proven that you can change DNA with light. It doesn't work like that. If you had 100 scientists doing experiments showing results, then that might prove something. Even 20. This is why every time there's a theory about some type of free energy device and somebody publishes it, or particularly cold fusion, the first thing is, well, let's do the experiment as they said that they did it and see if we get the same result. And they never do, because cold fusion is a pipe dream. So that's pretty much science in a nutshell. There's more about it than I want to go into. I could probably talk for hours on this subject. There's good science, there's bad science, but you want to be particular about any claim you make being scientific. Before I ever say something has been scientifically proven, I make sure I have the data so that I don't make a fool of myself. Now, I also talked about science. How did I phrase it? Psychic scientist. This doesn't mean these are scientists who are psychic. It means these are scientists who use numbers and study psychic ability and psychic phenomena. This is a dangerous thing for a scientist, because once his peer group finds out that he's doing that kind of thing, he doesn't get invited to the same dinner parties. They kind of ostracize people, because the reaction to it is what you would typically think anyone who has a rationalist view of the universe, particularly one where science is very much about the mechanical model of the universe. So these men, I feel, they're heroes, because they decided to do something that not everybody would approve of. And at the same time, they did it in such a way that they have been peer-reviewed. Their work is real science. It's not quackery. The first person I'd like to mention is Rupert Sheldrake. He worked with something called a morphogenic field. Now, his idea of a morphogenic field, in short, and like I say, there's lots of really good information on this, is that certain animals, if you were to cut, say, a worm in half, it knows to grow back the part of its body that's been cut in half. How is it that when we're growing a hand, how does your finger know when to stop growing? Why doesn't it just grow on forever? Well, his theory is there is a field, and that this field has a lot of different effects. And he also studies something called the phenomena of knowing when you're being stared at. And they've done a lot of interesting experiments with that. And they even proved that people have a sensitivity that someone is looking at them even if the person isn't in the room, if they're being looked at on camera. An interesting thing is when they started to find this out, people in the security industry said, oh yeah, we know all about that, because people are told that if you see somebody doing something wrong on the monitor, just stare at them and they'll stop doing it. How this works, he believes is a field phenomenon. I got my own ideas, but I'm not talking about my ideas today. We're talking about their ideas. So this is one of the things that Rupert Sheldrake studies. Also, he studies psychic pets. This is a phenomenon that's very, very interesting. You can send somebody. A lot of pets know when their owner is coming home. And what he did was, rather than to say, well, this is just anecdotal evidence, let's actually make a study of it. So they send people out. They put a monitor on the pet, and they didn't let the people know when they'd be coming home. So the moment they get the phone call to go home, as soon as they hang the phone up and start to get the taxi or go to their car or wherever, the dog will run to the door or to the window to wait on the owner. And this has been studied, and it's real. And so, and these experiments pass peer review. Another thing he also does is the sense of knowing who's going to call you. We've all had that feeling of you think of someone, then the phone rings and it's them. Or the phone rings and you're pretty sure you know who it is. And they say, well, you're just guessing right and you're remembering the times you get it right and forgetting the times you get it wrong. Well, he said, we can test this. And so he got people together and basically said, well, one of 4 of your friends is going to call you, or 5 of your friends, and you write down who you think it is before you pick up the phone. And he found out that the numbers are higher than what the average should be. So there is something going on there. Now, another person I'd like to discuss for a little bit is Dean Radin. Dean Radin does some really interesting work with computers. I understand he uses random number generation, and when the random numbers don't come up randomly, it means there's something happening in the world. He has a lot of computers that are chunking away at these numbers, and before an earthquake or something of that effect, the numbers get skewed. One criticism of this is that maybe an earthquake sets off some type of electromagnetic wave that has an effect on the computer chips, causing the random number sequences or random number generators to create a sequence or to be affected somehow. That's possible. And he even is aware of that. And that's what I like about these guys. They're good scientists. They're not so attached to their theories and their ideas and their hypotheses that they have certitude. Matter of fact, good scientists never have certitude about their work. They're always looking to get data on it because the data is what speaks for you. Another thing that Dean Radin, I believe that he's done is he's tested people's psychic abilities by showing 4 photographs to a receiver, and 1 of those photographs to a sender. So the person concentrates on the photograph he's seeing, and what ends up happening is 4 are shown to the receiver. The statistics should say that he will pick the correct picture 1 out of 4 times, which would be 25% accuracy on average. But when they do this experiment, what they typically get, time and time again, is a 35%. And so this doesn't mean that there's one person sitting there getting it right every time, but it does mean that the averages we're so far off average, we have an indication that there is some type of communication going on. There is something happening causing this person to, on occasion, pick the right photo out of what the law of averages say they should. So, I would say that this is solid proof that there is psychic ability, that it does happen. And people question his method. That's another thing I like about Dean Radin. He says, if you're a seriously minded scientist, you want to come down and look at how we do things, and you think that you can change it to make it to remove any doubt, by all means come down. He's not trying to fudge anything. They randomize things to the degree that they want this to be good data. Bruce Lipton is somebody else I'd also like to mention. He's a very and I include him in this category because he's done work with DNA manipulation. He was working back on stem cells long before the word was even used. He is one of the first people to start calling these things stem cells, and he was fascinated by the fact that the environment seemed to have a bigger effect on DNA, and your thoughts are a part of your environment. So you can alter your DNA by changing how you think. Now, there are layers of biochemical interaction that go with that. But, I still, because the word psychic means of the mind, even, whether this is something supernatural, like, Dean Radin's work or the psychic pets, I would call that supernatural until we have a theory for it. But what Bruce Lipton does may not be as supernatural, but it is a psychic phenomenon as I would look at it. Now, another person who I find very fascinating is Ian Stevenson. Ian Stevenson, his work was with reincarnation. He interviews children, or he's passed on, but he had interviewed children and got stories from them. And if you're even knowing a child who has a birthmark, and they'll make up some outlandish story like, I got shot here. They got a birthmark on the chest, and they'll say, well, I got shot there, when I was a man in my last life or something like that. Well, he took those stories seriously, and he took the details down, and he found out that there were instances where you could follow up on what the details that these children would say, and in the village down the road, about the time the child was born, somebody got shot at the same location that the child formed a birthmark. So he did enough research on this and gathered enough stories and applied numbers to this in such a way that his work was peer-reviewed, and it passed peer review. Now, he never came out and said, I have proven that reincarnation happens. What his papers, as I understand, his work was based more around the idea of there is enough evidence to imply this should be looked at more strongly. So he didn't necessarily prove reincarnation, but he brought it into the realm of science. So, these are what I would call fringe science, and I want to make sure that we understand the distinction between what is fringe and what is pseudoscience. Pseudoscience is bad science. Pseudoscience is like what Dr. Emoto does. He takes some water, have a priest bless the water, and then take pictures of it as he freezes and says, see, this is a unique pattern because the priest blessed it. And he said, or put a word on it. But these aren't repeatable experiments. If you were to get the same priest and have him repeat that experiment, you would not get the same crystals. But somehow he's convinced a lot of New Agers and a lot of people that this is somehow science. Well, that's pseudoscience. This speculation that this Russian doctor, I forget his name, but that he's shown light through a strand of salamander DNA at a frog's DNA, at a frog egg. So there was no connection from the salamander DNA other than light had passed through it at a frog's egg, and the salamander grew. This is just simply preposterous. This is pseudoscience. If this were possible and it was repeated and it was done 20 times in different labs around the world, then you could say, yeah, this is real. But there's no basis for this in science. It's pseudoscience. Fringe science is what these scientists that I mentioned, Sheldrake, Radin, Lipton, Stevenson, they're on the fringe. They're on the cutting edge. But at one time, if you studied electricity, you were considered fringe. And look at all the electrical devices we have now. So just the view that we had of electricity in the 1700s, might be a model for the view we have of these field phenomenon and these psychic phenomenon today. So I think it's very, very important to understand what psychic ability is by science and with science. As a tarot card reader, I take it very seriously that sometimes I'll get an idea, it'll come into my head, and I'm not sure because it wasn't in the cards, and when I express it to the person, it seems to be on point. Does this happen accurately every time? No. And that's why I'm probably the most authentic tarot card reader you'll ever meet, because I'm not about BSing people, and I am about the science, and I do believe that psychic phenomena is real, but I also know that when we have results that are 10% different than what the law of averages would say you would get by guessing, that is not a strong enough indicator to say that it's reliable. But at the same time, it is a strong enough indicator to say something is happening here. So I just wanted to explain what science is, how it can be applied to psychic ability and to psychic study and to a lot of things that we still haven't really got a good handle on yet. And I think that these men clearly are ahead of their time, and they need to be commended, I think, for having the kind of insight and the daring and risking their careers to study these things. So that's all I wanted to discuss for today. Thank you for sticking with me. Peace.